Hello everyone. Today we will be reviewing short story writing for CSEC English A. And as you know, this is going to be section C of the paper 2. Alright, so let's get right into it. So CSEC English A short story writing. Alright, and I think that this image is very appropriate because it is a diagram depicting the plot development, right? And I think it's very fitting. And of course, we're going to get into that later on. But before we do that, I have to give credit to Bing Images because that was the source from which I retrieved this photo. All right. So the elements of a short story, right? So first of all, what is a short story? So a short story is going to be it's going to be an account of events that usually only involves a few characters. It's not it's not like a novel where you can have several characters. It's only going to focus on a few characters, but it has to have all the elements of a full story, even though it is called a short story, right? So these are some important elements here that you need to bear in mind when it comes to short story writing. So you have setting, characters, theme, point of view, and plot. And we are going to go through each one and analyze each category, right? But these are some very important elements when it comes to short story writing. So first of all, setting. Your story has to have a setting. The readers need to know where it takes place. And where does it take place? Or how do we convey the setting? Well, we can do it in a variety of ways. You can do it through time, you can do it through location, and you can do it through the environment, right? The time would refer to the time of day, whether this be morning, noon, or night, or evening. The historical period, present, past, etc. Well, past in this case, yeah, past. The location, this is going to be an exact geographical location, whether that be a country, a city, a neighborhood. And then we have the environment. And it is worth noting that the environment does not necessarily mean the physical environment, but it could also mean the general conditions of the society. For example, economic, political, or social situations, right? And it could include atmospheric conditions, so that would relate to the weather, right? So all these would constitute, would make up the setting, right? So the setting is not just literally where the story is taking place, but there are other elements that can be part of the setting, like time and environment. And the setting is important because it provides context for other elements such as the plot, characters, and theme. And it also helps to establish the tone of the story, right? So that's setting. So here's an example of setting, right? Now, what I want you to do, I'm going to read it as well, but I want you to look at this, right? Look at this extract and imagine this particular town. Based on how it is described, I'm sure that you can visualize what this town would be like, right? So let's go. Maycomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks. The courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow, it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to hover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Now, this description is so detailed that it includes color, it includes atmospheric conditions. And what this does is that this allows the reader to visualize what the town will be like. So the reader is able to envisage themselves within the actual town, right? So when it comes to setting, it is important that we use imagery so that we can give our readers as realistic as possible an image of what the setting of the story, right? And this is a brilliant example of that. So we move on to characters, right? And when it comes to characters, there are two characters. There are generally two types of characters, main or supporting. So in terms of the main characters, you're going to have a protagonist, right? That's going to be the person or the persons that lead the story, right? So the story is going to surround this person or these persons because the protagonist could be more than one person. So traditionally, the protagonist is seen as the good guy, right? And then we have an antagonist. So the antagonist can only be an antagonist if there is a protagonist, right? Because the antagonist opposes the protagonist, and it's usually the source of conflict, which we'll get to later on. And traditionally, the antagonist is seen as the bad guy, the guy that comes to offset everything, right? But the main character is going to be the protagonist. And depending on the story, there can be an antagonist. But the antagonist is not always present, right? So yeah, just because there's a protagonist doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be an antagonist. Because the antagonist is a source of conflict, but this source of conflict is going to be a person, right? So the supporting characters would be those individuals that play a minor role, but are also essential to the development of the story. So we must make our characters realistic, right? We must make them seem like they're actual people. So how do we do that? We give them traits. These traits can be physical traits or these can be actions and mannerisms, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to convey as much realism as possible, right? So so in detailed descriptions of the characters, not just the physical appearance, but their actions and thoughts, etc., etc. All of those help to convey realism. Dialogue can also be very useful, right? So if the characters are speaking, that also helps when it comes to their credibility, right? Now the theme. The theme is going to be the central message of the story, right? And it can be any of the following. It could be a lesson to be learned, a perspective to explore, and an emotion to feel. The theme is going to be a little bit subjective because some people may differ on their views regarding the theme, right? Because the theme is what the reader is going to gather from reading the story. Of course, the author would have in mind the message that he or she wants to be, obtained from the particular story. But when it comes to the reader can draw different conclusions based on how they interpret the story, right? But the theme generally is going to be the central message of the story, right? Excuse me. Now the point of view. So when it comes to the short story writing, there are mainly going to be two points of views that are used, right? And those 2 points of view will be the first and the third person. So and the point of view would be, of course, be the perspective from which the story is told. Now, in terms of the first person, one of the characters is narrating the story. So the first person pronouns are used, like I or we. So the narrator is going to be one of the characters, right? So if you want to write a story about a personal experience, then you're going to use the first person because you're the one narrating the story and you are a character within the story, right? So when you do that, the reader is able to see your thoughts and feel everything that you experience, right? So that's one of the benefits are advantages of using the first person, right? On the other hand, the third person has two modes, right? You have the omniscient and the limited. And of course, third person pronouns will be used as he, she, or they, right? So the omniscient means that the narrator is all-seeing and all-knowing. He or she can see every character's thoughts, feelings, and actions. So the omniscient is sometimes referred to as godlike, right? Because he or she is all-knowing. Because in the omniscient, the narrator knows everything about every character. So every character essentially is representing themselves, right? So we get we get insight into each and every character within the story. But with the third person limited, the story is told from the point of view of one character within the story. It's not the first person, but it is the third person, but one of the characters it is going to be told from one of their points of view, right? So this is why it's called the third person limited. The omniscient means that it is told from someone who knows everything about all the characters, right? Whereas the third person limited is going to be is going to be told from the perspective of one of the characters in the story. But the first person is not used. Okay? So for example, if you have a story and Jeff is the main character, whoever is writing that story cannot be Jeff, right? Jeff has to be his own person. All right. Now let's get into the meat now, the hard stuff, or somewhat. Right. So the plot. The plot refers to the sequence of events that make up a story. In other words, it is a logical order in which events happen in the story. So, while you may be instructed to use your creativity and imagination in constructing these short stories, they still have to conform to a structure, right? You don't just write a story and write whatever you feel like. No, events have to be linked to each other, right? Our events have to be connected, right? And when we say plot, we are talking about how events develop within your story, right? So the order of events is as follows. So the first part is going to be our exposition. This is the beginning of the story. We introduce the characters and the setting, right? Because you can't just start a story and immediately get to the most dramatic parts. No, we have to build to that point, which is where at the beginning you saw the diagram where it started low and went right up, right to the top, and then went back down, right? And that is the pretty much a vivid demonstration of the plot, right? So we start with our exposition. We just introduce the characters and the setting. Our rise in action. So once we've introduced our characters and setting, Then we introduce the conflict. So the conflict, which we'll get to in a minute, right? But the conflict is just the problems that the problems that the protagonist or the main character has to face, right? Because the character has to have a goal. So the conflict is going to be that entity that prevents the main character from achieving that goal, right? So the events of the story become complicated, excitement grows as tensions get higher, ultimately leading to the climax of the story. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after we introduce our characters and setting, that's when we really start to get the story moving, right? The climax is going to be the biggest plot point. This is where the characters will be put in a situation wherein a choice must be made that will affect the rest of the story. The most drama occurs here, right? This is why it's called a climax. This is the most exciting part of any story, right? And of course, every story will have in the climax should be easily identifiable because it's going to be the most dramatic part, right? But yeah. Then we have the fall in action. This follows the climax, and this is when the tension has been released and the short story or the story begins to wind down. One will see the result of the climax, and the author also ties up loose ends in the main plot. And then resolution. This is the ending. This will be the outcome of the events of the story. The resolution is not always happy. It's true. We don't always get a happy ending, but it does complete the story. It can leave a reader with questions, satisfaction, or frustration. Yep, any one of those can be felt at the end of a story. I'm sure many of you would have felt that after watching a film or series or what have you, right? Or reading a book. Now, the conflict. What is the conflict? So, the conflict is the primary problem that the main character or characters faces in a story. Because, like I said, the character has to have a goal. What is his goal or his or her goal, right? And the conflict is going to be that entity or that problem that prevents them from achieving that, right? So it is the driving force of any short story as it influences the turn of events. Of course it does, because depending on the problem, we are going to see what action, you get it? Rise in action, right? What action the protagonist takes in resolving that problem, right? And conflict can be internal or external, right? So internal just means that the problems arise from within the individual, and external means the problems arise from outside the individual, right? So these are examples of conflict. So man versus man. Obviously, this would be an example of external conflict, right? So the protagonist is in central conflict with the antagonist. Opposing forces between two people can be a physical fight or a battle of minds. So man versus man would be protagonist versus antagonist. You have a protagonist who has an objective, and the antagonist is that individual who prevents the protagonist from achieving that objective, right? So that's a man versus man. So you will see this conflict very often in things like superhero movies, like Batman and Joker, right? You will see that a lot. You would have a hero whose objective is to keep the city safe or what have you, and then you have a villain whose objective is just to cause mayhem, right? So that's just an example. Man versus nature. So the central character or characters goes up against forces like nature, such as storms, animals, or natural disasters. Mhm. So man versus nature, that's external. Man versus society, the leading character struggles against ideas, practices, or customs of other people. Mhm. Yes, so that's external and man versus self. The leading character or characters battles with his or her or their own physical limitations, psychological struggles, and choices. So that would be internal. Mhm. Yep. Now, like I said, or like we saw previously, the plot consists of five elements. You have the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the fallen action, and then the resolution. Okay, so those are the five parts of a story. Okay, now plot devices are going to be techniques that are used to move a narrative forward. And when I say move a narrative forward, I mean make it more exciting, right? So these are used to enhance the story and encourage readers to become invested in the story. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. As authors, we want our audience, right? Our filmmakers as well. We want our readers or our viewers to become invested in the story, right? So here are some examples of plot devices. We have flashback, flash forward, foreshadowing, plot twist, and cliffhanger. And of course, we are going to review every single one of them, right? But plot devices are just techniques used to enhance your story, make it more exciting. Because even though, yes, it is true that you have to follow a certain order, every story has to have those five parts that we would have gone through. Even though that's true, you still have techniques that you can use to, make it more exciting. So, flashback. And as you could imagine, this would involve returning to the past. So it involves the interruption of the narrative flow to reveal a past event that is relevant to the story at hand. This is a way to give backstory and context or to reveal information at just the right moment. So the purposes, it is used to understanding character relationships and background, understanding characters' motivations and perspectives, and creating surprise or suspense. So an example of a flashback would be a story begins with a scene of a desolate and destroyed town, then flashes back to a time when the town was full of life and people. Right. So what the flashback does is it would return to a past event that gives some sort of context to what is happening now. So oftentimes we will be watching a movie and we see that the movie goes back in time. It goes back in time because whatever they are going to show you is going to explain what is happening now. So it gives background and context, right? So that's the first technique you can use. Now, the opposite of a flashback would be a flash forward, right? And it involves skipping to a future event in the story. So the writer leaves the current action to flash to a scene in the future, right? So what is this used for? It gives logical explanations to the actions of characters in a narrative, and it grabs the reader's interest in the current events of the narrative to see how the story develops towards the future that has already been shown to them. So an example of this would be a teacher talks with her students about what they might become, and there are flash forward scenes of students as doctors, lawyers, teachers, etc. Yes. So when you skip to the future and you already let your audience know, how the story is going, or not necessarily how it's going to end, but you reveal an event that is going to happen within the story. You skip the where the story is at and go to that particular scene. What you're doing is that you are prompting them to become invested because if you already know how it's so if you already are aware of something that will take place in this story, then naturally you're going to want to know how it got to that point, right? So many times you will be watching a film and the film starts with how the movie is going to end. So when they do that, they grab your attention from the start. They make you want to watch it to see how it got to that point. So that's why a flash forward is employed, right? So it gets you invested within the story so that you can see how the story got to that point or what led to the scene that you were shown. Foreshadowing. So when it comes to foreshadowing, the writer is going to give hints of something that is going to happen later in the story. Notice hints. They're very subtle. It's not going to be explicit, it's going to be subtle, right? So foreshadowing is used to build dramatic tension and suspense throughout a story, and it prepares readers emotionally for big reveals, right? So you have to be paying attention. You have to be paying attention. So a pipe is about to burst, but before it does, the author writes a scene where the family notices a small dark spot on the ceiling but ignores it. Now you see that? Now with this technique, it is subtle. Notice that with the example, they didn't say that it was not obvious that something was going to happen. But all the author did was that he mentioned the family noticing a small dark spot on the ceiling. So that would have been foreshadowing when the pipe would have when the pipe burst, right? That would have been foreshadowing because they didn't notice that something was wrong. So when that event happens, the reader is going to look back and say, you know what? Yeah, that was a sign right there, but they ignored it. So that was a sign. So foreshadowing is going to be subtle details that will tell you that will the foreshadowing is going to be subtle details that will tell you what will happen in the future, right? So you have to be paying attention to be able to spot foreshadowing, right? But foreshadowing should not be confused with flash forward. So the difference between these two is that a flash forward goes to an event that actually takes place within the story, whereas foreshadowing just hints at something that will take place. So those are different. Those are not the same. All right. All right. Plot twist. So this is very common one, a very common plot device. So what's a plot twist? A plot twist is just an unexpected occurrence or turn of events in a story that completely changes the direction or outcome of the plot from the direction it was ready to go. Because obviously, every story will have, yes, the five elements that we would have discussed, but in terms of that individual story, the reader is going to have his or her own opinions about what is going to happen based on how the story is developing. So what a plot twist does is it is a sudden turn of events that nobody could have expected or anticipated, right? So this is used to surprise the reader so that they're more engaged in the story. So an example would be a surprising person ends up being the puppet master behind everything. Yes. So this surprising person could be somebody that you would never ever believe would have any connection to, what was done, assuming that it's something bad, right? So that's an example of a plot twist. It has to be unexpected, right? So if you could predict it, then obviously that's not a real plot twist. It has to be something that no one could have predicted based on the way the events were unfolding in the story, right? All right. And cliffhanger. So this is an abrupt ending to a plot. There is no resolution to the problem and the reader is left hanging. Cliffhanger, right? These are often used in series to encourage viewers to watch the next episode, and it's also used to end chapters in a book. So what this does is that it is used to keep the reader eager to continue reading the story, right? So an example would be a book ends with the protagonist safe and sound, but the villain is on the run. Okay? So what a cliffhanger is an unresolved ending. So the story ends when it ends unresolved. So what this does is this exploits the human need to know what happens. That security mechanism that we have. We need to know what happens in the end, right? This is why the future is always scary, because we need to know how things are going to play out or what's going to happen. And that's what the cliffhanger does. It plays on that human need. So this is why when in a series, no, particular episode would finish unresolved so that you want to see what happens next, right? So that's something that you will see a lot in series, what is known as a cliffhanger, right? Because we need to know how the story ends. We need to have a satisfactory ending. And if it is not provided to us, then we're going to seek it, which is why we're going to continue reading. If there are more like editions or more films, we're going to continue seeking that resolution. So that's the benefit of using a cliffhanger. Now let's get into an example now. So these are sample instructions. So your answer should be, well, of course, you have two options. You have either picture stimulus or a writing stimulus. And we are going to do both of them today. This one is a writing stimulus, right? And a writing stimulus will just be a few sentences that are used to help you, to prompt you, to help you to think about a story. They're there to stimulate you. They're there to get you thinking, right? And of course, you have to include the sentences that they give you within your story. So your story has to be based on those sentences, right? So all the stimulus is there to do is to prompt you to think. So your answer should be approximately 400 to 450 words in length. You must write in standard English, however dialect may be used in conversation, right? So I don't think it's necessary to read all of that. So let's just get to the stimulus. So he looked, he wiped his eyes, he looked again at the screen and was sure he was not seeing right. No, he screamed, it is not true. Write a story which includes these sentences. Of course, back then it was 35 marks because this was the year prior to the change, right? And now it's 25. So we have to construct a story that is going to be based on this sentence, and we have to include this sentence within the story. So we have to make sure that wherever we put these particular statements, that they make sense, right? They have to make sense where they're placed. So you can't just put them anywhere in the story for the sake of following the instructions and think that that's how it's going to work. No, they have to be aptly placed within your story, right? So here's my first story, right? So I call it Grudge Match, and it's very good to put a title as well, Grudge Match. So we go. The alarm went off, so it was time for Jeff to start his training. This time around, he was determined to train harder because this match was a chance at redemption. As Jeff made his way to the gym to spar, he had flashbacks of his first defeat to Damien, who was one of the best boxers in Marshville. Marshville was a big city, and it was bright like Christmas whenever a huge event was taking place. So from that first paragraph, we see the protagonist, right? We see the protagonist, which is Jeff. The story is going to be based, and this is obviously third person limited, right? We see the we get the setting, Marshville, which is the city, right? and we are introduced to the goal of the protagonist, which is to avenge a defeat. So yes, so in that first paragraph, we have our exposition. We have the characters and we have the setting, right? So now we need to build up to the climax. So we need to show, now that we know the protagonist, the objective of the protagonist, we need to see now uh how he goes about trying to resolve that, or trying to achieve that objective. And then of course the conflict is going to be introduced. So what stops him, or what is going to prevent him from achieving that? All right, so let's go. The rematch was 3 weeks away, and Jeff was training intensely, so much so that he would throw up after the sessions. His coach constantly told him that he needed to let go of the defeat, but Jeff was a proud man and could not endure people's lasting image of him being flat on his back with a bloodied face. In spite of the numerous warnings from his coach, Jeff maintained the intensity, treated every sparring partner as though they were Damien. In fact, one time he told a sparring partner before the session, "I have to finish you." So we see where he's in action. His goal is to avenge the defeat. So he's training intensely, so much so that he would throw up after these sessions. So this man is training very, very intensely, right? And yes, so he's training intensely, even imagining that every sparring partner was Damien, right? So let's continue. As the fight drew near, Jeff started to experience nightmares about losing this rematch. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming and shouting, "I cannot lose." This desire for redemption had clearly become an obsession, and there was no telling what Jeff would do if he were to lose a second time. On fight night, Marshville looked very bright and, and lively, as it was going to be the place of the biggest sporting event of the year, Jeff versus Damien 2. No, Damien or Damien, I mean, it doesn't matter, right? So that's all. So we're still building towards the climax, right? So we talked about him experiencing nightmares, screaming and shouting, "I cannot lose." All this is building towards the big event, which is the climax. Remember, his objective is to avenge the defeat. So when he's training and all the nightmares he experiences, um, before this big fight, all of that will be raised in action. The tension is building, right? So now we get to the actual climax, which is the most dramatic part. So what's going to happen? Is he going to beat Damien, or is he going to lose? Right? Let's see. So the arena was packed to capacity and the atmosphere was vibrant. From the time the first bell rang, Jeff attacked Damien like a wounded tiger. Every punch he threw demonstrated the rage caused by the first defeat, and he was not going to ease off until Damien was on his back and bloodied like he was in the first fight. During the ninth round, Damien decided um, to taunt Jeff by telling him, "Finish me, you punk." This enraged Jeff, and he punched Damien more viciously, knocking him out in the process. Jeff had finally got his revenge, and now he was the victor, but Damien was down for a very long time. So in that paragraph, we see the climax. We see that it is fight night. He finally has his chance at redemption, and he actually knocks Damien out cold, right? Because he's walking with a chip on his shoulder, so he wants to really avenge this defeat. And he's taunted in the ninth round, and Jeff punches him so hard that he knocks him out. Right? So so now we move on to the fallen action. So we see the results of the climax, that he achieves his goal of defeating Damien. All right, so let's go. As Damien was taken away on a stretcher, Jeff hoped he would recover even though he had really wanted to hurt Damien. Jeff went to the hospital where he was being treated. Everyone looked sad and stared at Jeff as he walked in. Suddenly, Jeff received a text message. He looked. He wiped his eyes. He looked again at the screen and was sure he was not seeing right. No, he screamed. It is not true. Now, I used the stimulus at the end. That was my very last line. And as you can see how my story developed, that the writing stimulus was adequately placed, right? It was adequately placed based on how my story developed, right? So for an action, he was taken, Adami was taken away on the stretcher. He, Jeff hoped he would recover, even though he really wanted to hurt him, right? So yeah, and Jeff went to the hospital where he was being treated. But this is one of those cases where you don't get a happy resolution because it really doesn't say what happened. So this is a form of a cliffhanger because it doesn't say what happened. It did not say what happened to Damien. We can assume based on the ending that maybe you can assume the worst and assume that he's dead, right? But that isn't necessarily true. So this is an unresolved ending. So a cliffhanger, right? So this is an example, first example of a short story. This is a writing stimulus, and this was 450 words. So as you see, my writing stimulus was adequately placed, right? And of course, you have to ensure that you have paragraphs. Usually about at least four paragraphs um your short story should have. All right, so let's move on to the writing stimulus. So this is a picture here of the image. So you see someone driving and texting on the phone. So the name of this story is Teenage Milestone. Teenage Milestone. So Larry woke up with lots of excitement because this was the day that he was going to be 16. I hope that the window in the upper right hand corner isn't blocking you, but if it is, I'll read whatever is there so you would know what is blocked anyway, right? Not only was he grateful to be alive, but he was also eager to obtain his driver's license. Larry wanted to become a race car driver when he got older, so he could not wait to drive. He was spoiled and came from a very upscale neighborhood where there were numerous estates. Even before Larry obtained a learner's permit, he would use his father's second car when he went to work. So from that first paragraph, we are introduced to our main character, which is Larry. His objective is to obtain his driver's license, and we get the setting that he's pretty much a wealthy kid because he lives in a upscale neighborhood, right? So we get an idea of the setting. So let's see how he goes about trying to obtain that objective, and let's see what conflict comes in the way. Even though he knew that this was illegal and dangerous, he did not care because all he wanted to do was to obtain his driver's license. Once he obtained a learner's permit, he pressured his father to look for an instructor. Fortunately, he was able to find one immediately, and Larry was now set to commence his sessions. He had 2 sessions every week, and Larry's eagerness sometimes got the better of him. On a specific occasion, he was driving too quickly, or I should say too fast, but same thing, which prompted the instructor to yell, "Slow down," Larry said. "Relax, I got this." Now we see here that he is obviously going about trying to obtain his driver's license, but he has to battle with his own eagerness, right? So that is an example of an internal conflict, right? So he's practicing so that he can prepare for the test, but he has to battle himself, right? The truth was that he was a good driver, but he was overconfident. In fact, his instructor said to his father, there was no question in Larry's or there was no wait, hold on, where am I? There was no question in the instructor's or Larry's mind that he was ready for his driving test. Naturally, Larry was excited that the big day was here, and now all he needed to do was to execute. On the day of the test, Larry was as cool as a cucumber because he was confident in his ability and preparation. However, Larry's demeanor drastically changed when he saw the busy streets. During the test, Larry almost made a terrible mistake when he was about to cross a solid line in the road, but stopped himself. So we see we at the climax when he actually has to take the test because that's the big thing, right? All the tension that he, excuse me, all the tension that he experiences through in preparation for this big test. Now he has, he's faced with the challenge right there, right? Will he pass or will he fail? So let's see. Whoosh, whew. He whispered to himself on the verge of tears because that mistake would have caused him to fail the test. So despite the scare, he passed the test and obtained his driver's license. So he was extremely relieved because the day could have ended in disaster. All right, so we see that he passed the test, barely. He passed the test, right? So now we go to the foreign action and the conclusion. However, Larry was now able to drive by himself, something he wanted all along. His father gave him a second car and he was now free to drive whenever he wanted. So that's all foreign action. That is the result of the climax. He passed the test. He gets to use his father's second car. But now we go to the resolution. One day while driving, Larry was going to respond to a text message, but he never got to send his response. So another cliffhanger, right? Because remember in the image, it showed you, remember the image, the image depicted someone on their cell phone behind the wheel while they were driving, right? We assume that they were driving, right? So yeah, I decided to end it by saying he was trying to respond to a text message, but he never got to send his response. Did he die? What happened? We don't know. So another unresolved ending, cliffhanger, right? And as you see, my story was based on that picture, right? So this is how you build your story, right? Make sure you understand the different plot elements and make sure that your events are connected, right? And you can use some of the plot devices to enhance your story, right? All right, so that brings us to the end of this presentation. I hope that it was helpful. Thanks for watching and see you next time.